Okay, let's kick things off. Hi, everyone. Um, thanks for your patience with sorting out the technical stuff. Um, we can get started. So, to begin, I know a lot of people who really feel in the way a popular meme page uh, portrayed, I guess, when emotion related to economics comes up. And I find it quite funny, also a little bit annoying, particularly when judging. And that's not just because it's an area of knowledge which I have and others don't. That means that I have an advantage over it. But really, the funny or the weird thing about it is that it's really not that hard. So hopefully, what this workshop is going to be is a kind of discussion in the ways in which motions related to trade and economics, international economic engagements between states and multinational corporations exist in order to help you kind of. It's not even to teach you the necessary things, it's more like guiding you in the right direction, giving you the necessary tools to actually understand the kind of things involved in discussions around trade in order to then, do well in debates about them. So hopefully by the end of this workshop, you will feel a lot more comfortable with motions about either financial institutions or governments, what their response should be in terms of should they open up to foreign investment? Should they open up to allowing multinational corporations to come in? Or should they instead try and protect their own industries, protect their own companies, and otherwise make it difficult for the free market to come out? So to start off, the way this workshop is going to work, in part because of the slightly annoying delay between me saying words and you actually hearing them online, I'm mainly going to be talking, especially for the first part, go through the important concepts within this broad theme. However, with that said, please, if at any point you have questions, you can comment on the Facebook event underneath the post that the FINDA page made. You could also use the live chat function that YouTube has because I can also see those messages. It's just going to take a moment for me to respond, but I've left a specific segment at the end of today's workshop, which will be just dedicated to answering those questions. So hopefully you'll have asked those questions in advance, so we don't have to deal with the weird, you know, spaceship effect of taking 30 seconds to hear each other. So start thinking about potential questions you might have now, or maybe you've already started doing that, or perhaps as the workshop occurs. In terms of who I am, someone's already commented on Facebook. Yes, I can see your comment. All right, so I used to study in the UK. I graduated last summer. I went to 2 different universities and debated for both, and have been doing this for about 5 years. Really enjoy it. Don't really see why I should stop, though I have slowed down quite a bit because real life is a lot busier than it used to be. It's harder to ignore your boss than to ignore essay deadlines, it seems. And in terms of my kind of knowledge necessary to the specific topic that I'll be discussing, to be honest, like I did some economics at high school. Then for my politics degree, there were a couple of political economy modules where I kind of read a lot about the very theoretical components of trade or investment, but really that's not necessary to do well in these debates. I should note, though, before moving on, that if you've come to this workshop hoping to, as an economist in trading or someone specialized in political economy or trade regulation, that this workshop will be useful to you, it definitely won't. We're going to be looking at concepts at a high level and in terms of practical examples in ways that are most relevant to British parliamentary debates. that's almost certainly no way near as technical as a subject matter expert would be, and that's not something that I'm claiming to be today. So then, the first part of this is quite general. It's not even specific to kind of trade between states, but rather more general about markets and why we have them and how they interact. And so, in super broad terms, it's kind of useful to ask ourselves why is it that we have markets and what even is a market? And at its broadest, it is just the kind of platform which we might use to exchange goods and services. It is a possible way to allocate and distribute resources across society. For example, a different way would be a centrally planned one in which the government just decides who gets what, rather than people saying, hey, you other individual, here is something that I have that you want, you give me something that you have that I might want. And this is done, at least in the modern context in particular, through the price mechanism. And we'll go into that a little bit later. But basically, we no longer, or at least for most of our economic interactions, we don't trade goods directly. I'm not going to give you a cow and you're going to give me some fruit. Rather, we use money as the intermediary for that. That's kind of very basic grounding before we move on. So then, when looking at markets, we must ask ourselves, what is it that is so good about them? Or are the Marxists totally right that they are absolutely evil and horrendous? And while there are some legitimate criticisms, of course, of free markets in particular, there are some very important advantages and benefits to having them. It's kind of why they are the prominent way of economically interacting with one another and have been for quite some time now. And so the kind of concept I want to look at, and it's very relevant to trade in particular first, is that of an opportunity cost and comparative advantage. To put it quite simply, opportunity cost is when you choose to do something, you spend that time, that effort, in a way that you can't then spend on something else. If I'm spending this hour doing a workshop, I can't at the same time spend that hour on something else, going out with my friends. And if I tried, I would probably fail. The second concept of comparative advantage is the idea that it doesn't have to be that you are the best at doing something in order to be the best actor to do it, but rather all it has to do is with the relative difference between two, let's say in a simplified system, two individuals to decide who should do what. And over the next few slides, I'm going to be explaining those two things basically, in particular this idea of comparative advantage, and then explain how it links to the idea of trade and having free markets in our interactions. So, meet David. David, I believe, is a somewhat famous man. He's quite good at cutting the grass out of his house. He can mow his entire lawn in about 2 hours. That's pretty good. He has a big house, but he could also spend those 2 hours on a photo shoot and make $10,000 out of that. And so, to put it in slightly technical terms, assigning numbers to ideas, something that I know a lot of debaters are also quite scared of, and I was once too. The opportunity cost of David mowing his lawn, i.e. spending those 2 hours, is $10,000, because the best possible thing that he could do instead is worth $10,000 to him. And this is David's neighbor. His name is Scotty. And he's all right with mowing lawn, but he's not as good as David. He can go through David's house and garden in about 4 hours. The other thing that he could do during those 4 hours is work at McDonald's and get paid $8 for each of those hours. And so similarly, we say that the opportunity cost for Scotty to mow David's lawn is $32, assuming at least that he doesn't get paid to do that. And so the question then becomes, seeing as David is twice as productive as Scotty when it comes to mowing lawn, should he be the one to do it? You know, if you think about it purely in terms of who can do it faster, and maybe that's what David's really worried about, then yeah, he probably should. However, However, that wouldn't really make much sense, right? Because he could be making $10,000. That's quite a significant amount, and more importantly, he can't just pay Scotty something like $50 to do it. Now that's in David's interest because he can spend that time doing something that's going to make him quite a bit more money, and it's also in Scotty's interest because he'd be making $18 more instead compared to what he could be making working for McDonald's. And so we should take that as the kind of general idea to keep in mind. It's quite simple, really, that for different individuals, it's not necessarily the question who is best at doing something, but rather which combination of things being done by different people makes most sense for all of them, which one produces a win-win scenario rather than a win-lose or lose-lose one. And so this brings us to the question then, I had a slide about this. Yeah, this is basically a slide about what I said. Both actors, both David and Scotty, are better off with Scotty being the one mowing his lawn, even if David is the best one. And so you're probably wondering, what on earth does this have to do with trade? I came here to learn about the IMF or the WTO or at the very least countries trading with each other. And here Nick is telling us about cutting grass and famous footballers. Well, if you think about it, that same exact scenario, or at least, we can draw an analogy from that scenario and say, well, if one country is better at doing one thing than a different one, does that necessarily mean that it should be the one to do it? And the answer, in general, we've kind of realized for the past couple hundred years, if not much, much longer, that the answer is no. And this is especially true when it comes to comparing kind of industrialized, developed economies versus the ones that are either newly industrialized or still industrializing, America compared to Mexico, right? America might be more productive at, say, setting up high-tech factories to build cars, and they have a few of those as well. But Mexico can do that not just for much less money, even though maybe it takes them a little bit more time to produce those cars, or they aren't of as exquisite quality as possible. But that means that the American economy can instead spend its efforts doing other things that are even more productive. Like, for example, invest in Silicon Valley firms or investment banks. And I know I've probably just pissed off a lot of people by saying that those two things are better expenditure of time and people's resources than traditional manufacturing. But in many ways, it is. And even if you don't think those two examples are, take the general principle out of it instead. And so to kind of go back into the general stuff again, what is it then that makes this idea of a free market one in which David can choose, does he want to go on that photo shoot, or does he want to mow his lawn? Can he pay someone else to do it? And does someone else exist that is willing to do it? And it comes down quite heavily to this profit incentive and the idea of using price to decide how much goes to someone, what the cost of a particular good or service might be. And the reason why is that because people usually have a point at which they stop. They stop wanting something, they stop wanting to consume something or do something. And the reason why that is because eventually the extra benefit that you might get from consuming one additional unit of a particular good ends up being outweighed by the extra cost. You can only have so much ice cream until you think aside from being full, that you're not really benefiting from any more, in terms of pleasing your senses. And so the idea here is that individuals buy things until they no longer gain benefits from that. And similarly, producers, the people selling those things, sell them as long as they can still make a profit. It's this very basic idea of supply and demand that I'm sure everyone keeps hearing about when it comes to these things. But very often we kind of don't think about what those two concepts actually mean. What the price of something is a signal. Essentially, it's a signal to people and to firms about how much it is they should buy or should produce. Because if a product is priced too low, then a lot of people are going to want to get it because the opportunity cost of buying it is quite low. Imagine if you could mow your lawn for a dollar an hour instead of the much higher amount we saw earlier, the much higher amount that minimum wage laws require. And if that happens, it's probably going to run out quite quickly, right? And when that happens in turn, firms take it as a signal to raise prices. And realistically, they already have. They already know roughly what the reasonable level at which consumers are willing to pay for something might be. But if you think about it as a dynamic phenomenon, a system of different things being bought or sold, or people thinking about buying or selling different things, you have an effect where, at least in the idealized version, everyone gets what they want. People end up buying things if they're at a price that they want, and those who sell them do so at a price where they can make a profit and justify spending their time building and then selling that thing. And again, in the idealized version of a free market, things get allocated without any waste. Everyone ends up being happy because what that level of price is determines or is indicative of how much it's wanted and how much can be provided of it. And there's a couple other reasons why within free markets having this profit incentive can be useful. The first is that it generates competition. So if it is profitable for me to sell lemonade through my lemonade stand, I make a lot more money than it costs me to actually buy the lemons and buy the ice and have the cups and give them out, than it is to then sell them. Then that means that sooner rather than later, people are going to find out, right? People are going to decide they want to compete with me because they want in on this sweet deal. Because you can spend $5 buying lemons and everything else, and then sell that for $10 if that sounds like a good deal. And so when you have more players entering those markets, when you have more companies or more individuals doing something, it could be selling lemonade, it could be selling their labor, competing for the same jobs. That first improves the quality available because sometimes you have to provide a better quality good. You have to be a more suited, more experienced applicant applying for a job. And it also decreases prices, right? You can no longer charge $10 for a lemonade because other people are charging less because they know that that's how they can compete. So there's two ways you can compete in general. You can decrease your prices, or you can improve your quality, or you can do both. And that is a benefit to having that profit attached to selling something or providing something, because it attracts competition. The second thing, though I won't go into this in a lot of detail, is that it also attracts investment. What does improve quality mean? Well, in many cases, it means that there are lemonade stands all across a city. So it means that people don't have to drive all the way to your fantastic lemonade stand to access it. It means that you invest in research and development to find out what the perfect lemonade recipe is. And obviously, I'm talking about lemonade, but you can extrapolate this into any sort of thing, right? Pharmaceutical companies invest billions of dollars because they can then make a lot of that back from selling high quality drugs for diseases that previously were not curable or were much more difficult to cure. If they didn't have that promise of massive profit, they wouldn't invest those billions of dollars into R&D in the first place. And those things may still sound like they're not directly relevant to trade, but it's the kind of groundwork you often have to do, especially when you're defending the concept of a free market, one in which allows competition, one in which allows investment, one in which allows people to make profit out of different business ventures. And so it's quite important to remember. Now, so what we've covered so far is the idea, firstly, of trade, I guess. We've talked about why trading is important because it allows people to specialize in different things. It allows David to focus on playing football or having his picture taken. It allows Scotty to mow lawn or whatever else it might be that he is good at and, comparably good when it comes to other actors. And we've also looked at not exactly free trade per se, because we haven't gone into the details of that, but we've looked at this idealized version of economic trade where everyone can set up a lemonade stand, everyone knows when someone else is making a profit out of selling lemonade or whatever else, they know that they can come in and compete. And more generally, we allow this kind of economic interaction to happen. We use currency or other means in order to trade rather than rely on, say, the government centrally distributing jobs or food or whatever else. And so in many ways, it falls under what we might call free trade. But I think the best way to understand exactly what it is to compare it to what it is not. And that's the concept of protectionism. Now, I could go into I think I have like 12 or 10 different types of the most common forms of protectionism on the left. And if you want me to, we can go through those in more detail afterwards, just put it as a question on Facebook or YouTube. And when I'm done with the rest of it, I can go back and explain it and go through all of these concepts. But I think in general, and in plain English, protectionism is when the government makes it harder for external players, i.e. companies and individuals outside that country's borders, to compete with the players within it. And secondly, makes it easier and more preferable for domestic players to stay within that country and to compete successfully. So to just go into a couple of examples from the forms of protectionism listed on the left, an import tariff is when you say that if you're going to so an import, first of all, is when you, as a company that's not from a particular country, want to sell in that country. It's when China wants to sell its goods in America. That means that America imports those goods. And a tariff on that is an additional cost. Think of it as an additional tax, basically, to that importer. So that when a Chinese energy firm wants to sell in America, its, let's say, photovoltaic panels, solar panels, the American government says, okay, fine, we allow you to sell, but you'll have to pay us a 20% tax. So if you're going to sell these solar panels for $100 each, actually, you're going to have to pay us $20. And when that happens, almost necessarily, that means that China, in this example, or a Chinese company, has to raise its price because it has its own costs, right? If it costs them $90 to actually produce that solar panel and another $5 to transport it across, then it would have been making a $5 profit per panel without this tax, but now it's actually making a loss out of each one. So they have to raise their prices. And realistically, what this means is that the companies that don't have enough leeway, the ones that did actually need $90 to produce each panel as opposed to $60, they either raise their prices to the point that no one wants to buy their stuff, or they just don't sell to that country to begin with. An import quota is kind of similar, or at least it has the same effect, except the limit, it just says that there is a certain number, certain quantity of X particular good that can be brought in from other countries or from a specific country. Say China can export at most 100 solar panels and no more. and it still creates that same effect. And on the other hand, a subsidy is kind of, it tackles the same issue, but from the other side, right? I guess to stay consistent with the example, it would be the American government subsidizing its own solar panel companies, companies like Solar City, which is run by Elon Musk, and saying, okay, we know that you are a business. We know that you are selling solar panels, and we know that you've been having to compete with Chinese solar panels being sold in this country. What we're going to do is we're going to give you money, basically free money as a subsidy, or maybe we're going to give you a cheap loan, or maybe we're going to give you a discount on the amount of tax that you have to pay, or anything else that makes it cheaper for you to sell those solar panels. And so, not because we're affecting what the Chinese company is doing, maybe we don't want to impose an import tariff, but just because we're helping you out, it's easier for you to beat that competition. And if you think about how this interaction occurs, then how the system is affected dynamically, it realistically means that it still becomes harder for those Chinese solar panels to be sold. For example, because the American firms can now just charge less for their own, right? They can say, okay, we used to sell for $100, but since we're getting $50 per panel from the government in tax breaks or loan or cheap loans or whatever else, you know what? We're going to lower the price. We're going to lower it to $80. And so people are going to come and buy our stuff because it's much cheaper and people care about not spending too much money on their stuff. And obviously, if you imagine both these things happening at the same time, if the Chinese company has to charge $120 or has a limit on how much it can sell, and the American firm can even lower the price, that gives the domestic player a huge advantage. And that's the general idea. It's about national governments kind of shielding or boosting their own players and making it harder for others to come in. There's other forms of protectionism as well, and we can, as I said, go into detail for those. But really, in most debates, that's not very necessary. All that's necessary is that you understand the consequence of applying protectionist policies rather than the mechanisms, how they work exactly. You can also, Google those words, and I'm sure Wikipedia or other sources have lots to say as well. And if you find it interesting, there's various things I can recommend for you to read. So then, moving on, what might be the reasons why a country would want to be protectionist? I think I have 5 or 6 reasons here. So the first one is what we call an infant industry argument. It is the idea that, in theory, a particular industry that a country is developing in the future has the potential to have an advantage against other countries' industries, but not yet, right? That it's still a little baby, an infant, and it needs to be shielded while it grows up. And once it's grown up, it'll be, big and strong, and it won't need this support from the government any longer. And this is something that countries like Japan and South Korea and Hong Kong did quite extensively a few decades ago, right? They said, okay, we have no electronics industry, no superconductors, nothing else high tech, but we want to become, leading players within that. If we try and set up these companies now, or if someone tries to set up a superconductor factory now, they're not going to have the expertise. They're not going to have, the know-how. They're not going to be able to compete on price or quality because we're literally starting almost from scratch, right? And they're probably also not going to have the cash. Why would you randomly set up a multi-billion-dollar factory in a country that has no suppliers for the things that you want? It has no scientists that are expert in the things that you need to be producing. It has no workforce that has experience working with all these things. Why would you bother making that investment in the first place? You would do it, if you want to set up that factory, you do it in a country that already has the necessary workforce and infrastructure and potential. So the idea here is that you protect your industry in the short run, right? You throw money at it, you throw cheap loans and tax breaks, and maybe you do things like restrict the ability of potential suppliers to export. So, if you want to set up a car industry, and you're throwing money at it, but actually all of the domestic firms within your borders are exporting the raw materials needed by that company. Because, for example, China wants to pay more for that steel than your factory might or might be able to afford. You maybe tell those producers you're not allowed to export to China anymore, or you're not allowed to export at all, or there's a quota on how much you can export, and that would force that supplier to only sell to that infant industry and probably sell for a much lower price, or maybe it's a subsidized price as well. And the idea is that once it reaches the point where the workforce has been educated, where research and development has reached the point where it can now produce things that are efficient and high-tech, it takes less time and fewer resources to produce them, then you can relax those protectionist measures and allow it to compete with the rest of the country. The second reason, and I'm not going to go into detail for this one because it would take quite some time to explain in full detail, but I think the basic idea is quite simple. You might want to provide certain kinds of support just for correcting for things like pollution, right? To provide free resources or know-how for particular technologies, like factory technology that results in less pollution, or to say we're not going to allow foreign companies to come in because we don't trust their environmental record. So we're doing it purely out of environmental concern. More often than not, this can be kind of an excuse for something, but it can also be sort of more legitimate depending on the context. But I don't think it's hugely relevant to the realm of debating, at least. It's not the kind of argument that will make or break your case. And if it is, it needs a lot of detail because, for example, does the transatlantic trade partnership or the TTIP between the US and the EU kind of lead to better or worse environmental conditions? And those are really interesting. And if I had an extra hour, I would love to go into those details. But for the time being, I don't think that we do. So I'll move on. Then the other kind of really obvious reason why you'd want to be protectionist is just to protect jobs, right? So if through shielding your domestic industries, be they infant industries or more mature, it means that, the factories exist in your country, that means that the jobs exist in your country, even if, based on the theory of comparative advantage, it would be more efficient for those jobs to exist in a different country. As a government, you often just don't really care, or at least prioritize the interests of your own citizens. Then the next reason, and it kind of alludes to what I was talking about earlier, is to protect or sometimes even develop certain industries that are of strategic value. And what is of strategic value is obviously not like an objective standard. It could be things like the energy sector, because you want to be energy independent rather than every time that Russia gets pissed off, they threaten to cut your supply of natural gas, for example, as they have been doing. And so you want to say, we want to subsidize or otherwise protect our energy industry and ensure that we have one so that if something happens, that's not an issue, right? Because if you don't have electricity, that's much, much more important than, say, having fewer cars being imported because a car exporter got pissed off. It could be military-related industries, and this is one of those that in most countries there exists a certain form of protectionism or subsidy, or often the companies are just directly owned by the government because there's an obvious kind of existential even need to ensure that if you go to war, you won't need to buy guns from someone else that can either refuse to sell you those guns or tanks or planes or whatever else, or they might just jack up the prices because they know that that's when you need them the most. That's why a lot of countries have their own either entire military conglomerates or at the very least some production and development of military technology and units within their borders. But it could also be about your strategic interest, like long-term economic strategic interest, right? It's the example I gave earlier of countries like Japan and South Korea, essentially adopting this as a strategy for their economic development, saying that the state will be actively involved and it will nurture specific industries that we think will be particularly profitable in the next 20, 30, 50 years. That's exactly what they did, right? They said they saw high-tech industries like superconductors as something that was really promising. And they said, we want to become experts at this. We want to become leaders in those markets. Obviously, to do that, the state needs to take a very active stance in shielding those companies initially from external use, ensuring that they get all the resources necessary to actually reach that point. The final argument in defense of protectionism, and it's funny because it's essentially the opposite of what I was talking about in terms of Chinese solar panels versus American ones, is against the practice that is called dumping. Dumping is when a country, and very often China has been doing this, it'll subsidize the production of a particular good. Let's say once again solar panels, right? It'll subsidize them to a ridiculous point, and it will even have its state-owned enterprises on purpose sell that at a loss, right? So if it costs them $20 to make that solar panel after subsidies, they're going to sell it for 18, right? At a really, really cheap rate in a different country. And what this does, if you do it for long enough, it means that the other companies within that country just can't compete, right? They literally go bankrupt because their state is not willing to invest as much in subsidies, or perhaps their government doesn't think that is the correct thing to do. Most Western governments in particular are generally quite against protectionism and have been for many decades. And so the result is that in the short term, obviously there's a benefit to consumers because now those things are much cheaper. But realistically, what it means and what it has been historically is that one, you lose those businesses, you lose those jobs, which is a problem in and of itself. But it also means that you displace that domestic industry. Once every other solar firm has gone bankrupt in America, let's say, and it's just the Chinese ones exporting, that means that they can raise their prices as much as they want, right? Because let's assume for a second that solar panels are something that people really, really need, no matter how expensive they might get, or at least up until they go to, $300. So China's going to sell them for $250 each. And, in theory, that's the point where new companies get to form and develop and compete with those Chinese ones. But one, those firms could again start lowering their prices massively. And two, it also means that the other problem is that it takes time to, develop an industry, to build a company, especially if it's something that is relatively complicated, like solar panels. And so oftentimes, governments use protectionist measures to stop this kind of dumping, but more importantly, as is the case with most kind of hard measures like this, to deter that dumping in the first place. Because if China knows that the moment it starts lowering its prices too much, then that's when, it's going to have import tariffs on its companies, it's going to have other trade restrictions and quotas, or they might subsidize their own industries. Then that's not in China's interest either, right? So in the same way that we all, or at least the big countries have nuclear weapons to prevent each other from actually invading, similarly, having protectionism as a tool, even if it's one that you don't actually deploy, is useful because it prevents those kind of interactions. At this point, are there any questions? I don't think I've had any. No, I have. Okay, let's see. Right, I'm gonna look at both of those at the end because they're more complicated. particularly Alex's question. Sorry, I know that must be a little annoying. The reason why is because I'm conscious that we don't have too much time. I suspect for your question, Alex, it may be best to continue this offline, but I'll have a think. Before that, though, and unless if other people have questions, what I want to look at is now the flip side. The reasons why protectionism can be very dangerous or very unwise, economically and politically speaking, which effectively is answering the answer to the previous section of why is free trade then good, by explaining why its absence, i.e. protectionism, is not. And so, there's going to be a bunch of reasons why this is the case. In general, it is because it often invites this retaliatory response. So what I previously kind of characterized, and I think in a debate you may well characterize as this kind of deterrence, kind of incentivizing countries not to do this to one another, really it can also spiral and escalate into, tit for tat protectionism, and cause what we call a trade war. And even without that, actually, can still harm the people that it's meant to protect. One thing that's also worth noting before we even go into those reasons, though I don't think it is, especially compelling, particularly in a BP debate, is that the consensus from economists, at least, is that protectionism is generally really unwise. Now, obviously, that is not something that you can't dispute. We've seen a lot of politicians lately do that, and a lot of people believing them. See Donald Trump leaving the Trans-Pacific Partnership, see him generally, not wanting immigrants or wanting to put tariffs on China and stop them from doing what they're doing because they're killing us, as he says. But it is something worth keeping in mind. And sometimes in debates, just mentioning, right, and alluding to the fact that there's a consensus against something kind of reminds the judges that there's a reasonably high bar for the other team to prove something. Similarly, if you're proposing protectionism, you can say just because economists think something, because they prioritize, say, for economic efficiency, doesn't mean that socially or politically or in the long term, in a sustainable fashion, it is actually the wisest thing to do. Those were a couple notes, kind of much more debate-related than content-related. So then, what are the first few reasons why protectionism might not be a great idea? So to use a slightly kind of technical phrase, because it leads to market distortion and loss of allocative efficiency. Now, to put this more simply, right, it means that it distorts that system that I was talking about at the beginning of this workshop, whereby you generate those win-win scenarios, right, whereby you ensure that people get what they want for the lowest amount of money that they can get it for, right? It means that prices go up for the consumer, because when you put up a tariff, when you put up an import quota, and you say China can no longer sell things for as cheap a price, that does lead to the very real effect that things that people buy, sometimes on a day-to-day basis, sometimes less frequently, but all contributing to their living costs, go up, right? It means that it becomes more expensive. Food becomes more expensive because, foreign competitors aren't able to sell the stuff that they'd be able to, not because they're not as efficient, but rather because there's a law, a tariff, a tax that prevents them from doing so, right? Oftentimes, so this is an example with the European Union's Common Agricultural Policy, which is a series of different subsidies to farmers all across the EU. In theory, you're like, wait, if we subsidize our farmers, one, that means that farmers get to keep their jobs, they get recognized for the good that they do, it improves our food security because we can have all of our food or most of it produced domestically. And three, if we're subsidizing it, surely it means that it can be cheaper. However, that's not really the case, or at least you can argue that's not the case. First of all, because when you provide these subsidies, it becomes harder for competitors from abroad, i.e. from, in this example, outside the European Union, to compete with you, right? Because you can afford to at least temporarily lower your prices, or maybe even on a more long-term kind of fashion. It means that if it's more expensive for you to produce agricultural goods being in Africa or Latin America than it is to then sell them in a European market, which is one of the biggest markets in the world in general, especially when it comes to consuming such stuff, then you go bankrupt, or you just, because it's not to your benefit, the opportunity cost is too high, you just do something else, right? You don't produce that kind of food. And when that happens, that means that competition goes down, which means that those farmers have less of a pressure to improve, lower the price or improve the quality of their goods. Now, because of, the tons of regulation around food, quality probably doesn't change too much, and fruit is still fruit. But what does change is the price at which things are sold. So through giving that subsidy, which in theory should be able to lower the price, actually, aside from the fact that now people in much poorer countries are not able to make a living out of farming, and oftentimes that can be their only option, which, for moral reasons is probably quite bad, but also on a more practical and self-interested sense, food is more expensive for the people in your own countries. And that's probably not ideal. It doesn't mean that it's the worst thing in the world, and maybe you can argue that, preserving those jobs of farmers is something that is worth that cost. Though I think that very often, or in most debates, if you try and run that, judges are likely to not be very persuaded, or at least the other side is more likely to be able to make arguments against that. It is something that you can run. And so when that happens, when cost of living goes up, when there's less competition and prices go up, that leads to a loss of economic welfare for the people on the ground. That means that you need to spend more of your money buying food and have less of that money for savings, for education, for fun, for anything else that you may want to have. So your livelihood, as an abstract average citizen, goes down. Then, in terms of other things, the first thing, quite obvious, and I think I've kind of mentioned this really already, is that you put up extra costs for exporters. Now, in some ways that is a harm in the ways that I described. Obviously, from the perspective of the protectionist, that can be a potential benefit. For example, because you don't want them to export. The other quite interesting effect that it has, and again, I alluded to it with the African farmers kind of example, is that the impact is not felt equally by everyone within the country, right? If the price of food goes up, doubles, obviously that has an impact on everyone because everyone eats food. But if I'm making $100,000 a year, sure, it'll mean, a few fewer Uber rides for me and my friends after we've gone out. But it's not going to be a real cost. On the other hand, if I'm making $20,000 a year, that's going to be quite significant because things like food, things that are basic necessities, take up a bigger percentage of my income as someone who makes less money than someone who makes more money. That's why, rich people can afford to save more money, they can afford more luxuries. And even if they buy, more expensive food, fancier things, that's still something that they can change. It's not as important an impact. When you kind of extrapolate that across the entire economic system, when you are a country that is generally protectionist, that imposes protectionist measures on a lot of different things, and that increases the cost of living for your citizens, that impact is most felt by the poorest in that society and least felt by the richest. And that means that income inequality and social inequality goes up. Again, that's probably not a very good thing. Finally, and this I think is really interesting, right? Because if we go back to the idea of an infant industry argument, the idea is that you nurture that child until it grows up, until it is big and strong and able to compete with the big children outside the playground, right? The big Chinese companies while yours is still an infant. But really, what it means is that you reduce the incentive to actually want to, quote unquote, grow up, right? To actually become more competitive. Because if you know that you are shielded from competition because of your government subsidies, then that's just less pressure for you to become more competitive. Firms don't become competitive because, in the same way that people want to be the best at sport, they want to be the best at producing cheap cars, right? They do it, and the primary motivator is because if they don't do that, they'll get beaten by a different firm. They'll get beaten by a different country's firm very commonly. And so when those subsidies exist, that reduces that incentive, which realistically means that it takes much longer to quote unquote grow up. And actually, and this is something I've not written down, if you think about the way in which large companies interact with their home governments and how through lobbying and other means they can shape the policies that affect them, automotive firms have lobbyists that campaign in favor of laws that favor that industry within that country. It also means that the government won't be like, look, you have to become more efficient, otherwise, because I'm going to be cutting you off subsidies in 5 years' time. But it means, oh, okay, maybe I guess it's not 5 years, it's 10 years that you'll need of subsidies. And you have that kind of clientelistic effect, effectively. We can call it even corruption, whereby companies, it is easier for a company to lobby its government for protectionist measures than it is to become efficient. And so it's not even a case of an infant industry or otherwise needing to be protected temporarily or maybe in the long term, but it's just because it is in the business interest of the company for that protectionism to occur. But as we looked at just earlier, that doesn't mean that it's in the interest of that country, let alone of the entire world. Then a couple more things. There's quite a few reasons why protectionism isn't great. And as a note here, just because there are so many reasons doesn't mean that your debate speech should go through all of these. That's probably going to be quite a mistake because you won't have time to explain them. But it's useful to be aware of what they are because in different debates, different things will be differently relevant. And also if you're closing, maybe you need to extend in particular ways. So trade wars is essentially something that is a risk that comes with protectionism. Like I said earlier, maybe protectionist measures can act as a threat that I will put up trade barriers if you do X, Y, or Z. But it also means that once it happens, you have to do it yourself, right? If China, if a particular country raises protectionist barriers, what do? Do you put up protectionist barriers yourself to help your companies compete by subsidizing them or by blocking exports into your country? Or do you do nothing? If you do nothing, you lose the most and they win much more. If you put up protectionist barriers yourself, though, you can at least mitigate that cost and ensure that, your jobs aren't totally ruined as they would be in a world where you didn't do it. And then once you put up protectionist barriers, that invites further retaliation, right? It creates an escalation, a race to the bottom whereby those things increase. And so all the other harms, again, also increase. And so the next thing, and it's something that's really important to note whenever you talk about, an entire country, an entire economy, an entire industry, is that, it's not a household that can spend its money wisely, as people often talk about when they're looking at, central government budgets. But really, the country itself is what generates economic activity, right? The entire economy generates economic activity. That means that if you impose trade restrictions on a different country, that country is then in turn less able to trade in as large volumes, right? And maybe they're not a direct trade partner with you, but every country that isn't North Korea basically is involved through a very complex web of trade with most other countries. Sometimes it's directly trading, other times it's I give money to country A gives money to country or trades with country B trades with country C, and so indirectly countries A and C also trade. Now if you disrupt those kind of chains, that means that it then ends up hitting you, hitting you back as well, right? Because if you are decreasing net economic activity, i.e. how much is traded in the world, because of your protectionist measures, that ends up hitting you too, right? Because it means that you can, say, export fewer cars because there's fewer people willing to buy cars because they have less money to spend because their living costs have gone up. That kind of process is what you end up creating, and so it's very dangerous. Finally, though I would be quite cautious about running this within a debate. I would potentially run it to throw off a team, to have them rebut this point rather than others. But it does have quite some merit, and is that when you are overly protectionist, that can be a threat to peace. And really, if you think back to this idea, which I'm sure lots of you have come across, which is trade interdependency, i.e. that when countries trade with one another, and so they rely on each other's economies being strong and stable in order for their economies to also be strong and productive, that means that if you sever those ties, if you stop trading with each other, that stops being in your interest. When you are trading with each other, that means that, sure, maybe you're pissed off at one another, maybe there's actually quite strong tensions between your peoples and potential of war, but you know that if you go to war with that country, you're kind of going to war with yourself as well. Because, if you blow up their factories, then your people can't buy the things that those factories were building as it was the case. If you blow up their populations, those are your consumers, the consumers of industries that you have in within your borders that trade with those people, sell them stuff that they want. And so as you reduce that level of trade interconnectedness, you also reduce the incentive, the economic incentive at least, not to go to war. Finally, I promise that this is the last kind of slide with arguments against protectionism. It's really important to recognize that these things stack up, right? That if a particular industry that you are subsidizing is providing things which are vital, not just for that industry, but rather for the entire economy, that can then, create a huge chain reaction across your economy. So my favorite example of this is of what Brazil did, right? So they did not want American and Japanese companies coming in to sell computers. They wanted to be, for them to be the leader within that, but they also wanted to have that as one of their strong industries. The thing is, because of all the inefficiencies that I went through, right, they weren't able to actually nurture a competitive computing industry. But also, the lack of that and the fact that companies like IBM were not allowed to come in to sell, much better computers to the various companies existing within Brazil, that meant that the entire economy didn't get to benefit from the computing revolution. It means that where in all other countries, or in most other countries, the introduction of computers allowed for a certain degree of automation, making things easier, making things more transparent, Brazil was left behind. And so the kind of lesson there is that if you're going to do it, and this is what the last slide on protectionism is, if you're going to be protectionist, you need to do it in some ways which are careful, right? So the first is, you can't hand out protectionist measures to all of your industries, right? Maybe it's important for you to nurture some industries where you have the potential to actually become a leader, but you need to shield them in the short run. But you can't do it to everyone, right? You can't do it in a kind of unconditional way, because if you do that, then that's when you end up getting the harms and very little of the benefits. That when you raise living costs or don't allow your economy to modernize just because some cronies within an industry get to benefit. And the other thing that's really important is that you kind of set a very, very strict and tight expiry period for those, right? You tie having protectionist measures to specific rules. And really what I want you to keep from this slide is that if you're going to have to be propping protectionism in one way or another, In the same way that when you're propping a lot of policies from OG, you need to be like, okay, here's a couple points of definition or of mechanism. Obviously, we're not going to do this in the stupidest way possible, which is what opposition might accuse us of. No, we're going to do it in a much more clever way, right? So one thing that South Korea did was that it was linking that protectionist measure to how much gets exported within global markets, right? And so it means that if you end up being a strong exporter, that realistically means that you are able to compete with international players. You probably don't need as much support, and so protectionism can get phased out. I mean, even then, right, South Korea is not a perfect example because there were lots of, or at least it's not a completely idealized example, because there was a lot of corruption, a lot of engagement between its large firms and the government, and it basically had to go a very painful purge to go through that process. But on the other hand, it was, you can't deny that it was through protectionism that it was able to develop as strongly, or at the very least, that it was able to develop, and it also was protectionist. Now, there's some people who will argue that actually countries like Japan and South Korea would have grown faster without protectionist measures. I think that's plausible, but quite difficult, and it is generally much difficult to do it without those things happening, because there is some merit to things like wanting to, subsidize or protect your infant industries, but it has to be done properly. You have to have experts make decisions rather than politicians do things to win votes or bribes. Now, I know we're kind of running out of time, and I was also running out of time when putting this together. And so I was going to have a section on multinational corporations and how they come into play. Unfortunately, both in terms of this workshop and the preparation for it, I just didn't have the time. I work many, many hours a day, so unfortunately it wasn't possible. But also, I think it would be a bit of an informational overload. One thing I would recommend, aside from kind of Googling the terms that I've been mentioning, if you want to read more about it, is to watch this. It's just one 7-minute speech. It's the Prime Minister speech from Chennai Worlds in the Open Grand Final, and it's quite beautiful. So the motion is, if I remember correctly, that India should aggressively liberalize its economy, i.e., that it should lift all the forms of protectionism that it has. And while the motion is specific to India, if you listen to Josu's speech, if you listen to the arguments that he makes about why things like currency controls are bad, about why having state-owned enterprises as opposed to the private sector be in charge of your industry, and how once you remove those restrictions at once for everything, you can unlock a lot of benefits. I think that is a really good speech to listen to and take notes on and learn from it, and actually use that in the future. I without any shame, admit I took detailed notes of that speech and have used them in like 10 or 15 debates about free trade. And I swear I've never lost a debate when using those notes. They just are really, really useful. Because obviously, he's not a unique source of that information, but I think given that it fits in a 7-minute speech, given that it's really structured, properly explained, has some examples, though the examples you probably can't use because they're specific to one country, or at least you can't use them consistently. It is definitely something that I would recommend you watch. If you just type Chennai WDC Grand Final Prime Minister, you'll find it. Okay, so now I guess it's time to look specifically for the things that people have been asking for. Mila has already linked the speech. Thank you very much for doing that. I should also say that his partner's speech is also really, really good and worth watching. It's just slightly less relevant to this particular debate, but I definitely would watch both. So to look at Mila's question first. So your question is, I'd be curious on how exchange rate manipulation works in terms of protectionism and examples of countries doing this. Sure, so if I go back to one of the very early slides on what is protectionism, where is it? Exchange rate manipulation. So the basic idea is that an exchange rate can exist kind of free in a market like every other product, and the price of which can vary based on its supply and demand. But it can also be more closely controlled. And so a government may intervene in a foreign exchange market, i.e. the market in which currencies are sold, in order to lower the value of its currency. And it does that by selling its own reserves of that currency in the foreign exchange market. Right? So that means that when you're relatively cash rich, you can spend some of that cash to make your currency price go down. And you'll ask, but why would you lower the value of your currency? That sounds weird. That means that it's worth less money. But there is a good reason for doing that. Firstly, because it actually raises the cost of imports. It means that your citizens, as China, actually struggle more to afford American products now. And it also means that because it's more expensive, because you still have to pay those in dollars, and the dollar is now worth more yen than it used to be, or in RMB. And this essentially functions in the same way that an import tariff does, or at least it achieves the same outcome, which is it becomes harder for foreign companies to sell things within your borders. The second thing that it does is that it also lowers the cost of your exports because, if your currency is cheap, that means that instead of costing $100 once you convert currencies, it actually costs $80 to buy a particular thing. Again, that achieves that kind of effect where it becomes easier for your players to compete and harder for theirs to do so as well. Now, obviously, if you engage in that kind of policy of direct intervention, you will run into issues like generating inflation and raising the cost of your exports. However, if you look at what China does, for example, it just pegs the price of its currency to a certain fraction of the dollar. And so as the price of the dollar moves, the price of their currency also moves. And so that's the effect that it achieves. Now, how exactly it is done, beyond the kind of basic description that I gave about selling your currency into foreign exchange markets, I don't think it is necessary. It's a little bit complex. And to be honest, I'm not sure I fully, I'd be able to do that part of the answer justice. But essentially, that's what it is, right? You, through various means, manipulate the price of your currency, which means that you change the real price of your goods and of the price of other people's goods when dealing within the borders of your country. I hope that made sense. Does anyone else have any other questions? Or should I start at least reading Alex's long one? Okay. So, Alex, I'm sorry for not directly answering your question. It's quite a long paragraph, and I think I kind of need to sit down and think about it. I'm also not 100% sure which part, at least, of the paragraph you're interested in hearing my thoughts. But obviously, feel free to message me after. I'll be happy to have that conversation with you, or if you're coming to Euros, we can also talk about it then, because I do like talking about that kind of stuff. Cool. So if no one else has any other questions, um, let me just make sure I've refreshed Facebook. I think we can call this a day and wrap it up. All right. I hope all of this made sense. And if it didn't, well, I guess for starters, it would have been ideal if you'd mentioned it already. But no worries. If you want to get kind of clarifications, either bother me on Facebook, on the Facebook event, or drop me an email. I'll be more than happy to go into your questions and also look at the thing, look into answering Alex's question when I've actually had some time to think about it in more detail. But yeah, thank you so much for having me. I hope this was useful, and best of luck with EUDC and debating and anything else.